Thanks for joining us for another episode of DPC Radio. This episode was recorded live in Amsterdam at the Dutch PHP Conference 2012. For more information about the Dutch PHP Conference, visit our website, phpconference.nl.
All right, everybody hear me? Everybody in the back? Can you guys hear me? Okay, good. All right, we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Chris Cornutt. I'm from Dallas. I'm a co-organizer of the Dallas PHP user group there, and I also run phpdeveloper.org, if anybody reads that. I'm going to talk to you today a little bit about the combination of ExtJS, the JavaScript framework, and Zend Framework. Honestly, nothing that I'm talking about is specific to Zend Framework. You could take that and replace it with the framework of your choice on the back end. I just happen to be familiar with Zend Framework as far as using it with EXT, so that was why I chose it for the example. So how many people in here have used ExtJS? Oh, good. That's more than 212. And Zend Framework? There we go. Okay. That's what I figured. Okay, so EXT is, for those that don't know, is a kind of a full stack JavaScript framework. Things like Backbone kind of give you the pieces, they give you the models and the views and everything. EXT, with the release of 4.0, introduced a full MVC system. So you have your full model view controller set up, and it comes with a whole bunch of extra stuff like extra widgets and panels, and you can stick in renderers and all sorts of stuff. It's a very powerful system. It's also not the smallest JavaScript library out there. So if you're looking for something compact, you might want to look at something different, more like Backbone or whatever. It's designed to be cross-browser, and it works great with pretty much any kind of interface, not just a REST interface or anything. You can customize pretty much everything about any of the components in this framework. Like I mentioned, it's full stack framework. It has all the stuff built in. Pre 4.0, it was a little bit more, here's a component, and it kind of shares a similarity with the Zend Framework that way. Zend has their MVC stack that comes with it, but it also has, all these other components. EXT gives you a whole bunch of, a lot of it's more visual kind of things, like, it gives you the basic panel kind of component, and then it gives you things that build on top of the panel, a basic window or, a layout interface, that kind of stuff. There's actually some pretty handy stuff in there that just comes with it out of the box. It has some good event handling. You can set, pretty much any kind of JavaScript event plus custom events on any of the components and pretty much any kind of thing that comes with the framework. And unfortunately, like I mentioned, it is rather large. I forget how much the full download is with all the documentation and everything, but the ext all file, if you use that and include it, I think that by itself is a meg. So there's quite a bit of stuff in there. Fortunately, you can take that and you can pare it down. And if you're only using the MVC structure and maybe 2 of the widgets, you can take that and do a custom build off of that, and it makes it a whole lot smaller, a whole lot easier. They include the ext all. They include the ext all is minified, so you get the lovely errors, error on line 2. There is a non-minified version of that. There's a debug version that gives you a lot more information, and there's actually a minified version of the debug version. So I don't know why they put that in there. It's not the easiest thing in the world to learn how to use. It has a lot of little quirks that you kind of have to get used to. Like, for example, if you're rendering a window component, you have to give it a title, otherwise it just doesn't render and it doesn't error. So stuff like that is really fun to track down. Because it is so configurable and because you can configure things in so many different places, sometimes it's really hard to figure out where the best place to put it is and what the configuration should be so that it can be the most flexible. Unfortunately, it's like any piece of software that gets large, it's not bug-free. Cinch is pretty good about it, but they've had a habit in the past of not paying attention to certain components and releasing some buggy code, and yeah, anyway. And it's not very lightweight just because of the size, the general size of it. Obviously, if you're going to use it, when you deploy it to production, you're going to want to minify it along with all the rest of your code, whether you use the MVC structure or not. If you just want to use the separate components, you can use call an ext load on those and just include those in, or you can include the actual files or whatever you want to do. When you use, especially when you use the MVC structure, there is an autoloader. I don't think it uses require or anything like that. I'm pretty sure it's their own autoloader that's enabled by default, so that whenever you call something, you'll see in the code examples, it'll make a little bit more sense. Whenever you call something, it actually autoloads all the resources associated with that for you. So you don't have to worry about loading 20 different JavaScript files just to have access to your models and your views. Like any MVC structure, it's got the controllers, the views, and the models. It also has a thing called the store, which is essentially the front-end data store. These can be hooked into REST API backend or any other kind of API. They also have adapters for like local storage. You can point it at a file, just any file, XML or text or anything like that. It has built-in JSON parsing, XML parsing, and I believe you can set up your own custom parsers, your own proxies. I haven't tried that yet, but I'm sure you can. Has all the event handling included. The autoloading, like I mentioned, is on by default whenever you use some of the MVC stuff. If it's not on, you can just call the ext loader and tell it to start it at the very top of your application. When you create things with it, you can hook it into your current page and have the events fire on HTML elements that are already in the page, or you can just let ext generate the source for you. It's kind of strange the way it does it. It's very verbose. I'll show you some of the source that it generates for some of these examples. It uses an auto-incrementing ID for the elements on the page. So anytime you change anything, your element IDs are going to change, not the ones you specify, but the ones it uses internally. So you can never count on the actual ID number as being something you can point to, like with XPath or anything like that. It makes it kind of hard when you're running like Selenium tests or anything like that. You have to possibly toss in extra IDs and use different kind of selectors that are specific to the tests. They include theming. There's a default theme that comes with it. It's kind of a bluish kind of template. But they also provide the less source for that, so that you can go in and modify that if you want to and recompile it and push it back out. The elements that it generates are not the simplest structure, like I said. So redefining some of those CSS rules is a little weird sometimes. There's a lot of different classes that will apply to a lot of different elements. So you really have to be sure once you change one that you go through and look at everything just to be sure. Some of the common widgets that are included with it. There's the toolbar. That's essentially what it sounds like. It's just a container, basically, that you can put anything inside of. You can put menus. You can put just regular buttons or forms or anything like that, and just embed them inside as items. You can do menus, drop-down menus with the secondary menus, date and color pickers, and I'm going to show you examples of these in a second. There's the different layout types. They've got a good example on their developer site that I'll try to show. I'm trying to cram all this in because I had 3 hours to do it the other day. But they have a good example of a bunch of their different layout types that come bundled in with it. Data grids are possibly one of the most well-used and well-developed widgets that they have for it. It's got all sorts of fun stuff, like you can do inline editing, you can do sorting and custom filtering and renderers on the rows, and it's very handy. You can do some charting. It's not overly fast, but you can do it. And form handling and just a generic kind of data structure and data tree kind of thing. And there's lots of others too. The toolbar, the actual toolbar is just the part where it says new refresh tools. It's the container for that. By default, it doesn't have anything in it. You give it whatever you want, what kind of content you want inside of it. those are actually menu widgets with buttons, and you can define the separators as well. Those are objects too. It comes with the two pickers, the color picker and the date picker. They have them actually coming out of menus there, but you can fire them off from buttons or whatever you want to. The data grid, like I said, is one of the more powerful ones. You can see the inline editing right there, and it's pretty customizable. Say you have some kind of validation on one of those form fields, it can gray out the update button until it meets those requirements. You can redefine those buttons. By default, it comes with sorting and filtering client side, so it doesn't have to refetch. I think it does pagination by default. There's an actual pagination bar that you can embed in the bottom of the grid. There's an example of some of the charts, just a bar, line, and pie chart. There's a couple other ones that they provide in there that I just didn't have time to put in examples for. And then the tree widget, everybody's familiar with that from file systems. You give it the basic data structure for all that stuff, and it figures out which are the bottom ones. You can tell it what icons to render with them. You can tell it, specifically this one needs to relate to this one, so that if you open one, it opens another one. There's all sorts of fun things you can do with those. And they have something called a double tree, and I don't really understand what use case this would be, but it mirrors the same tree, so that when you open one over here, it opens the same one over here. So I don't really know when you would use that, but...
Maybe for sort of FTP client and so on.
Oh, yeah, that's true. If they mirrored the structure mirrored. That's true. Hadn't thought about that. And just an example of some of the forms. These are the rendered forms. This is not like an HTML form with EXT events added on top of it. You can see some of the validation, how it'll give you, if you don't have a correct value, it gives you that lovely, red underscore line. And that's the default style for the error messages. Usually you have to mouse over those, but you can tell them to pop up if you want to, and kind of force them to come up. And it has all the standard HTML elements, including some of the newer HTML5 functionality as well. The basic layout types that come with it, absolute positioning. There's the accordion one, which basically it's made up of different panels or cards. I forget what they call them. And you can click on the header, and it expands that one out and makes the other one smaller. It's like the accordion. An anchor layout is usually what's used by default in forms. It has the title over here and the field over here, and they're just anchored together on that center. The border one, that is probably mostly used for interfaces. The border layout is something that gives you, by default, it gives you a center region, and then you have your north, south, east, and west around that. So if you load up your page as a border layout, you can have your toolbar load in the north, some sidebar load on the west, and just build it up that way as the different components inside that layout. By default, you only have to have a center layout. So if you only want to define the north and the center, then that's great. But you have to have that center one if you're going to use the border. Cards are just basically what it sounds like. They're just panels put in next to each other. Columns are just straight down. The fit layout, it takes everything inside of it and tries to make it as big as possible to fit whatever viewport that you have in your browser. Tables, like it sounds, you can structure them in tables, row spans, call spans. VBox and HBox. So the VBox is for the vertical, and it tries to expand it vertically as far as possible. And then HBox is for horizontal. It doesn't, like the fit will expand it the entire way. HBox just does it horizontally. So onto the different parts of it. The default controllers, it's the EXT app controller. Everything extends that. Obviously, you can have your own controllers that you can extend off of if you want to. Whenever you define it, you define the models, the views, and the stores that go with it. That auto-loading goes ahead and pulls those in whenever that controller is initialized. And so those resources are already available to you. The init function, the other the other components, the models, the views, and everything, they use init component. Controllers just use init. I don't know why they made it different, but it is. That's caught me a few times trying to catch, bugs and why it wasn't starting up things correctly. And then it handles the actions through a control property on there. When you define your control, you define like a CSS selector that references the object that you're trying to add the event or the action to. And then you define either what function or, inline define the function right there in the JavaScript to take whatever action, like for a button on a form window or something, go ahead and submit that form. And that way you can kind of keep some of your functionality centralized inside of that controller if you need to, like the interface stuff. Here's a basic example of one. The example.controller.index is the name of the controller. Extends the base. You can see how it defines the user model, the stores, and the views. When you're doing, now this is the MVC structure. If you're just using the components, you just load the actual JavaScript, or load the actual ext object, and you're fine. When you create your MVC application, though, it launches this, and it follows the structure. So, a typical MVC structure, like if you're familiar with Zend Framework, you've got your controllers in one directory, your models in another, and all that kind of stuff. And the paths have to match. And I'll show you one of the example front controllers, essentially, that ext uses to define where the base path is. And it assumes that those folders are going to be in there. You can redefine those folders, obviously. It gives you methods for that. But by default, it'll be /models, /stores, and all that. The index.user is the notation they use essentially for subdirectories. So it's like view, index, well, this is in stores, but you can do it in views too. But, it would be stores index user in the actual directory, and then it knows where to find it. And you can go pretty much as many levels deep as you need to on that stuff. And then the init function that just fires off whenever the object is created. It will, when you're using the MVC structure, it will initialize the controllers first and then call any actions on top of them next. So you don't get them right after each other. It does all the controllers first, loads all the resources for it, and then fires off any actions in the init and everything. Just some key parts of it, like I pointed out a second ago, the init. The control is where you define the CSS selector and the action that happens based on that object. Refs are just references. So if you have a view that's 5 levels deep and you don't want to have to type out that entire string every time, a ref is essentially just an alias. So you can set that up, and then anywhere in the application, I don't know if it's controller specific or not, but you can use that alias instead of that long string. Makes it kind of nice whenever you have more complicated things, larger structures. Whenever you set up your stores and your models and your views, it automatically creates getters and setters for you. So, for example, down here in the bottom, you can say get the list. That list references that alias up there, and it has a selector on it that basically says select the grid. In this case, there would be only one view with a data grid in it. And that data grid they have a type of grid. It's called an X type in ext. So it would, by default, it builds this getter right here. So you don't have to build that in yourself. It automatically creates those. And then it fetches the store off of that grid. When you're working with any kind of data, you always want to use the store and not the actual object itself. So when you load up a grid, you have to point it to a store or to some data source. Whenever you want to modify a value inside of that grid, you actually modify it in the store, and the grid will automatically update itself. When you call a set or a get, no, that's not right. When you call a set on any value that's in the store, it'll automatically try to refresh that store and sync it back up with the server if the auto sync is turned on. This also gives you an idea of how you can use the control in there. The only reason I had it in there was because sometimes you need to do something a little bit more complicated to it. You need to reference something that's outside of the, like you need to pull a file from someplace else or a value from someplace else and use it in the, in the selector or something like that. Obviously if it's outside up there with the views and the models, you can't do that because it's just a property. So it's handy to do that right inside there. Models are similar to what they are in Zend Framework. You extend a default model. You define all the fields and their types for it. Models will be linked to stores so that you know the structure of the data inside the store referencing the model. And they can have the methods of their own. So if you want to go with the fat model method instead of putting it into the controller, you can still have all your functionality in the model, and that way you can swap it between your controllers if you need to or whatever. And then you can set validations on it. So you can set like the name of the fields, you can set the type that it's supposed to be, you can set a validator property on there so that it can run through some of the included validations, or you can set your own custom ones if you want to. And then there's the init component, that I mentioned that everything except controllers use. This line here, the call parent, if you call init component, you have to call that call parent. Otherwise, it just freaks out, and ext won't render your component or your object because of the properties that it sets up and all that kind of stuff. Just some of the common things that are in there. There's the fields, there's the validations. You can define those on the fields directly if you want to, or just a general validation set that it needs to run through for everything. So you can call it and say, is this data valid? And it would give you an entire result instead of just, is this field valid, this field, all that. They do have associations for models. They're relatively new, and so there's still a lot of quirks with them. They're not particularly useful at this point that I've seen, and it's kind of tricky to use them. So if you try them out, be a little wary that they may not work 100%, but they work pretty well. And when you define your model, you define a proxy for it, or you can define a proxy for it. And that's just the data source. The stores, they are the client-side data, or they contain the client-side data. You work with them whenever you work with any of the data on them. You can set up a proxy on them, and that's usually where the proxy is set up in an application, not on the model. You can set it to auto-load and auto-sync. So when you create the store, by default, it won't necessarily pull in the data for you. If you don't set the auto-load on it, you have to actually call the load function or load method on it. If you set it to auto-sync, anytime any data is changed in there, it will go ahead and try to resync that data back with the server. So if you update something in your grid and somebody's updating something over here, if they're both set to auto-sync, then they'll both look the same all the time. You'll get the changes they made, and they'll get the changes you made. Otherwise, it'll just stay in the browser until you hit save or whatever your button happens to be. Here's one of the examples of kind of a default store. This one points to a model, but you don't necessarily have to point it to a model. You can take the field structure and put it directly into your store if you want to. And you can define default data if you need it to come up with something, rather than having to hit the data source every time. Views are really what all the extra stuff, or a lot of the extra stuff that comes with EXT is. It's all those widgets and stuff that I mentioned earlier, and some little handy things that you can put in toolbars and everything. They don't extend a default view type. I take that back. At their base level, they extend a default, but they're usually 3 or 4 levels removed from that. So, you'll have an EXT window that extends the EXT panel, that extends the EXT container, that extends EXT base. It just keeps going down. You can alias them. It's usually you'll see it in a sec. It's usually by default, it's widget dot something. And then you can use that alias much like the references in the controller anywhere in your application. When you reference something, like a default panel, it has an X type of panel. The grid has an X type of grid. If you set up a widget dot something, you can use your something as an X type, and it identifies it as long as that thing is loaded. And you can set up the nested views and the nested widgets. You can pretty much go down as many levels as you want to, but if you're using ext to render the source for it, generate that DOM, you probably don't want to go very deep just because of the overhead that's involved in rendering that stuff. It tends to get a little slow if you go 2 to 3 levels deep inside of something. You can usually do an interface, some panels, and then some stuff inside of that. And after that, it starts getting a little shaky. You can see the alias up there, that widget.button panel, so that any place else in the application, I could just call this view button panel. The X type of button, that's a default button that comes with ext. That's just the standard button element. You set the text, and you can set a handler. You can either set that in the controller with that, this control or the control property with the CSS selector, or you can reference it directly in your view. So if you have view-specific logic that you need to perform whenever that's called, you can just call it directly in that handler on that object. And then the typical init component and everything. You don't have to define an init component if you don't need it to do anything when the object's created. If you just want it to create by default, you don't even need that function down there. You can just define the items inside of it and some of the basics about it up there. Okay, so on the other side, Zend Framework, everybody's a little bit more familiar with. You have your usual controllers. When you start up with your front controller and run through the MVC structure, this is all Zend Framework 1, by the way. Those are the controllers that it runs through by default. Unless you set up any custom ones, any custom dispatching or anything like that, then it'll do extra stuff. But by default, those are the ones that are used. You use action helpers to augment their functionality. You can set up the pre-dispatch and init, similar to the ext stuff. And then you can get the request values and the parameters and everything off of the call. Just a sample controller. I'm sure anybody that's used Zend Framework recognizes this structure. You have your init that's called whenever it's created, and the basic, the index action structure, so that whenever you call it on the URL, it would be /example/index. And then the router knows to route it to that index action function because of that structure. Models in Zend Framework, they're kind of open-ended. They give you some stuff to work with. You can extend like the ZendDB table just for a default kind of interface, or you can hook in whatever you want, like Doctrine or Propel or anything like that. It plays pretty nicely with pretty much anything. And since Zend Framework is so customizable, you can configure a whole bunch of stuff that way too. It has the relationships, has one, has many, all that kind of stuff built into it. Just an example model, has this one extends the ZendDB table and has the name of the table as chat messages, and then has a function that just gets the latest ones. Views, you have your standard views for the Zend Framework. For that, it's just the output. It's the template in the HTML or anything like that. They're not specific objects, the actual views themselves. They're the PHTML files. You can have partials, and you can have it working with templating engines like Twig or Smarty or anything else like that. And just a basic view, you have that reference to this output, which was sent out by the controller and passed out to the view. So combining them a little bit, this handy-dandy chart shows you just kind of how the general flow of it all works. You've got the Zend Framework side up there, kind of the back end, and then once it outputs to the view, then ext takes over. And in the ext routing, it hits the controller and then grabs the data from the model in the store and then outputs the view. In ext, a lot of the usual stuff, so if you're just using widgets, using components and stuff, it's pretty easy. It's when you start getting into the highly customized stuff that it gets a little tricky. If you're using like the grid element and you want a custom renderer on one of the rows or one of the columns in there, you kind of have to do a little workaround on some things to get it to cooperate. You can also have custom plugins for this stuff. So if you have a row expander, the grid comes with a row expander by default. So you can have one row that has a little turn down or whatever you want to do button, and it expands out more content below. You can have a custom plugin for that to do extra stuff inside of there as well. Those are a little difficult to work with. Some of the stuff is not really straightforward. You can do some of the HTML5 features. Like the drag and drop stuff, you actually have to create a bunch of custom objects and a few custom elements to be able to use it. It's not just, create a drag and drop object and stick it in my page kind of thing. I think they're working on that right now to make it a little more simple to use, but I haven't seen anything recently about it. And of course, if you're using EXT, you obviously need some JavaScript knowledge because it's a framework. It's not going to do every single thing for you. So, you can use it, but you still have to know how to do certain other things. Zend Framework similarly can be a little overcomplicated at times, just because you can configure everything. You can, reuse components and pull in anything you need. And sometimes the structure is just, difficult to cooperate with. The flexibility, it's not a do-it-all for me kind of framework like some of the other full-stack frameworks, like Cake or Fuel or Symfony. Symfony is, it generates a whole bunch of stuff for you. So you kind of have to piece together the parts that you need. And one of the things to consider if you're making a JavaScript-heavy application, front-end heavy, that you want to think about whether you want to make it a single-page application and just reload your views and reload the components on the front-end side, or if you want to actually make it separate resources in the Zend Framework side with the different components loaded on there. I've seen it done both ways. Generally, EXT makes it a little easier to do a single-page kind of thing. Then you only have to have one front controller, and you can just pull everything in there versus having multiple in each of those different resources. Okay, so I'm going to show you some examples here. Hopefully, let's see. Yeah, I've got some time. So good. I won't be able to run through all of these, unfortunately, but if you're interested in seeing how any of these other ones work, come find me afterwards. I'm more than happy to show you the code. The real-time one is kind of interesting. It's kind of fun how everything works together. So let's see. Let me mirror my display real quick. There we go. All right. So can you see that? Let me make this a little smaller here. Okay, so starting from the Zend Framework side, we have our example controller that, by default, I don't really need anything in my view. EXT is going to handle building my interface and building the sample window that I'm going to have. So Zend Framework doesn't really need to do anything except say, okay, go render my view. Whenever it loads up the view for this basic application, you have it load the EXT library. There's that EXT CSS file, and then I just have a default CSS that has some other stuff in it. And this is my EXT front controller right here. So whenever you create that, you create an instance of the EXT application. You give it a name, and that's the reference. So if you ever reference any object by its full path inside of the application, in this case, it's going to be example1.views.index.whatever, .users. You tell it the default path for the folder, and then any controllers that are involved in the application. The only reason you would define them in here is if you want them auto-loaded from the start. If you have a specific controller that you only need in a specific case, you can manually call the loader, and it'll load that controller and all of its resources that are associated with it. And in the application, you have this launch function. That's the only place you have it. In this case, it creates a viewport container and generally by default, that's what you want to do. Just create a viewport, And this one has the fit layout, so it tries to, expand everything as large as possible, or expand itself as large as possible, let me say that, to fit the thing. Otherwise, it just kind of centers it in the body, whatever you're looking at, and the viewport would be really small in this case because I didn't define any height or width or anything like that. The X types here, the default win and the utility bar, those are aliases on the views that I have. Let me show you those real quick. So you can see the sample structure over here for the EXT side. I've got my example one, my actual code lives under an app folder, and then there's the app.js front controller. Those are naming conventions only. You can name them anything you want. You can have multiple app folders if you want and be able to switch between them. But usually it's recommended that you have the one front controller in the app directory with your controllers and views. And I don't have any models or stores underneath this example, but you would have those under there as well. And similar to the Zend Framework, you would have your scripts directory with your views underneath that. This, you have your views, your index directory that relates to that index controller, and then your views for that underneath it. This default controller, or default view, you can see it extends the basic window view. There's my alias for it, that default win that was referenced in the controller over there. The default win ID is a ID that you set on it so that it's actually put out into the source. Otherwise, it has an internal ID that you can reference it by, but it's not as useful usually for hooking in CSS or anything. Like I mentioned before, you do have to define a title for a window, otherwise it won't output it. It does a fit layout on this one too. And by default windows, you have to set the auto show to true, otherwise it creates the object for you, but it doesn't show it. So if you didn't set this, you can have your window object in there, and when it auto loads that, it would just create that object for you, and it's just sitting there essentially in memory waiting for you to use it. If you set auto show to true, then whenever it's loaded, it'll go ahead and pop it up. Just a handy little feature. And inside of that, you can see how you define the actual items inside of the window as that array down here. This X-type panel is just the default panel. There's almost nothing in it. It has some extra properties that its base class, the container, doesn't have. And most of the panel-based classes will have an HTML property. So if you want to just inject straight HTML inside of it, like an inner HTML value, you can. Or you can have items inside of the panel and items inside of that, and keep going. You can also define some of the properties on it. This is essentially like defining CSS properties. It doesn't try to set a width equals whatever on the actual object. You can also manually set the CSS properties if you want to as a string or an array set. And then the utility bar is pretty simple. It just basically creates a button that says reopen, and you can see the handler in there. In this case, I try to get the component of default win, my other view, and if it's not there, if it's undefined, then it goes ahead and tries to create a new one. And you can see that full path, example one, view, index, index. I didn't have to use that full path there. I could have said default win if I'd wanted to, and use that alias over again. There's two methods in EXT. There's EXT get, that'll just kind of get you the information about the element. And then there's the get component, which is what this one is. And then that actually returns you an EXT component that then you can perform operations on. Otherwise, it's just an HTML element that it gives you back. So let me show you what that looks like. Oh, and by the way, if you want to clone that repository and take a look around, it has all of these examples in there, all the code for them. You'll have to set up a Zend Framework instance and kind of drop it into it, but it's pretty easy to use. They're all in separate directories, so you don't have to worry about configuring anything. So our basic application that I just went through looks like that. since the window is set to auto load, it pops up as soon as I load the screen. By default, all windows will have this close button up here, so you don't have to have a close, regular button if you don't want to, and it just destroys it. I believe it actually destroys the object and not just destroys that instance of it. So it's you would have to do a create on it to be able to get it out again. And then if I click my reopen button, it just does a creates that again, that view again. I do want to show you real quick the different kinds of layouts. This is that dev site that I was mentioning. You can kind of get an idea. There's the absolute layout where you actually give it the position of them. The accordion layout lets you click on the different bars. So if I clicked on that one, the rest of them slide down, and that's all automatic. They give you the source that you'd need to do it down here. And for most of them, it's really just defining a layout and defining the items inside of it. There's the anchor layout. You just kind of tell it where to put it and then how wide to make it. The border layout, that's the one that's most useful for navigation. Or not navigation, for interfaces. And it does some of the handy stuff like resizing, and you can shift the stuff over to the side if you want. There's a setting for that too. Let's see, it does tab panels for you. So you can just create your, layout of tab panel, and then you create your items inside of that. Those can be panels, that can be anything you want. You can set up your tables. The vertical box, does it vertically, and then the horizontal box does it that way. And there's custom stuff too. I also want to show you real quick their documentation. So they actually use EXT to build their documentation. But it is very, very verbose. You can see it defines this. If you click on the title up here, you actually can go and view the source for that object directly. So you don't have to go searching through your source if you don't want to. And then it gives you some examples, a couple of more examples apparently for the store. And then it starts getting into the config options and the methods and the events and everything that are a part of that object. You've got it all over here on the side as well, but usually I just end up searching for it up here. Let me think. That's probably all I can get in for now. Does anybody have any questions right now? I know I kind of rushed through a whole bunch of that stuff. I'm sorry. I tried to get in as much of the content as I possibly could, but anybody have any questions?
If you compare Ext against Dojo, performance-wise, do you have any experience?
I have very limited experience with Dojo, but I honestly would say, depending on what you're doing, EXT would probably be a little slower. If you're using the full component set as far as the EXT all. If you chop it down and only take what you need out of it, it just depends. Yeah, similar stuff. Yeah. Anybody else? Mm-hmm.
Basically, with this setup, every page is a separate EXT.js app.
It can be, yes. Yeah.
What are the pros and cons of using this approach against the one window, one app approach?
So usually if it's one window, one app kind of thing, you can share the resources across it a whole lot easier because it's all defined under that same name, like example one. If it's across multiple apps, you kind of have to tell it where to find those other files. And then it tries to load those. If it loads those, it may have other dependencies in that other application, the other page. So it's a little more difficult. It's not terribly difficult, but it's easier, and EXT likes it better if you do it as a single page. So. Anybody else? Okay, well, let me know if you want to see any of these other examples. I'm happy to show you, but I'm done.
DPC Radio is a production of iBuildings. The materials presented are copyright of the speakers. This episode is released under a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives 2.0 license. iBuildings is a full-service web development company specializing in PHP development. For more information on how we can help you with your next web project, visit our site at ibuildings.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope you'll join us again for DPC Radio.